You are listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. And thank you for coming back and joining us once again. I am your co-host for today, John Wood Jr., joined for the first time in a duo capacity by my colleague and co-host, April Lawson. April, how are you doing today?
Great. It's good to be here with you.
Yeah, well, it's good to be here with you as well. And we're meeting at an incredible moment for America, and we understand that folks are facing a real challenge out there in the world. We want to let people know that we are with you. We are standing with everybody who is working to pursue justice, to pursue a stronger society. We admire the courage that folks are displaying in this moment in American history. And I think that a big thing that we want to do is get a better understanding of where we are on a psychological level, on a cultural and social level, and really just get some perspective on the moment. And so for that reason, we're thrilled to be joined today by a person whose work and whose example has been very impactful for me, for yourself, I know, April, and for so many of us at Braver Angels and well beyond. And that is author of books including The Happiness Hypothesis, The Righteous Mind, The Coddling of the American Mind, and a speaker who has been featured across a variety of formats, podcasts. You've heard him on Making Sense with Sam Harris, The Joe Rogan Experience, etc. Jonathan Haidt, welcome to the Braver Angels podcast.
Well, thanks so much, John. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And so you heard my introduction, John, and we are in a moment that is immensely challenging. There's no need to skirt around that truth. But I think that there's a lot of confusion on the part of many people in terms of how we got to where we are. What are the proximal explanations for our circumstance? And as a person who's studied, I think, and who's just sort of a leading authority on these sort of different sorts of moral and psychological languages that people with different religious, political, and ideological dispositions have, I'm wondering how you analyze the moment that we're in. What can you tell us to give us a bit more understanding about where we are?
So first, let me just start with one little fun note here. Knowing that April was going to be on the call, I looked up how I first met her, how David Brooks wrote to me in 2016, I think it was. And I just want to quote this. David said, "I have an amazing research assistant who is wise beyond her years. She's one of the best editors I've ever had. Her long-term goal, but over the long term, she's hoping to devote her career somehow toward reducing polarization." So I just thought I'd introduce that this is so it's a pleasure to be talking with you, April, to see how you are living the life you laid out for yourself, and you had no idea it was going to get so much more challenging.
Absolutely. And I just have to say, it's really good to be talking with you. And as you know, The Righteous Mind, I think this is just true for a lot of us in this space. Like it was the thing that crystallized for me what this problem like really looks like, how people with good hearts can be on both sides. And it's just, I think it's hard to overstate how much impact your work has had. And I also had the privilege of working with you briefly on some of the campus work. And anyway, it's just been a wonderful.
So we may come back to that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's been wonderful to work with you.
Yeah.
So to answer John's question, I guess we can go back to some of the ideas in The Righteous Mind, because that's the summary of my own work as a social psychologist who studies morality. And what I've always tried to do in my work is look at evolution, like what is human nature, how did it evolve, but also look at anthropology. How do the forms of society that we see vary? I'm not a determinist. There's a complex interplay of human nature with culture, and of course everything can change over the course of just a few decades too. So we're a very dynamic species. And I guess what I'd like to put on the table here first for all the listeners is, let's really lower our expectations for humanity. Okay. Now, it sounds depressing, but let's be serious here. What kind of creatures are we? We are primates who evolved to live in small groups that dominate territory in competition with other groups we're really, really good at coming together to fight those other groups. Part of our preparation for doing that, I believe, is the psychology of religion, sacredness, tribal rituals. We have all this really complicated stuff we do that binds us to each other. This is a human universal. Every group has rituals. I'm a big fan of the sociologist Emil Durkheim. And so from that kind of perspective, we ought to still be in pre-civilization times with very high rates of murder. And somehow we escaped that. Somehow we've had this incredible ascent, this unbelievably rapid ascent, in which we've gotten wealthier, smarter, healthier. We've made extraordinary progress on women's rights, animal rights, gay rights, the concern about the environment. So let's start by appreciating our lowly origins as really violent tribal creatures and the way that we've rocketed up from there. Okay, now, in the last 10 or so years, 10 or 20 years, we've had a little bit of a come down. And so I really want to put this not just in evolutionary perspective, but in sort of recent historical perspective, because this, I think, is the key to understanding what is happening to us now. It is that we were fooled in the 1990s into thinking that democracy was easy. So the founding fathers were under no such illusion. They knew that democracy is prone to faction. That's what Madison wrote about, especially in Federalist 10. They knew that democracy is generally self-destructed. So they gave us all kinds of safeguards. They tried to create a system that would not be so prone, a system in which these tribal, irrational, emotional creatures might actually live together. And it worked pretty well, and it worked badly at times. But by the 1990s, we had the mistaken view that if we just wait for Iran and Russia and North Korea to develop market economies, they'll get prosperous. Their people will demand rights. And this was true for China too, we thought. The people will demand rights. And you know what? Liberal democracies will break out everywhere. Liberal democracies are the end point, the end of history. And so that's the way those of us who lived through, I'm older than you guys, but the late 20th century was an incredibly dangerous and exciting time in which there was a victor, and it was liberal democracy. Okay, but like in a lot of movies where it seems like there's an early denouement and like everything's great, then we still have a lot of stuff to go. And in the 21st century, things have really come down from there. So that's the backstory. Now, there's so many pieces to it, but the one, actually, wait, I don't want to go off on a long lecture about social media yet. So let me first start. You're younger than me. Does this history seem right to you? What has your experience of America been? It was like a narrative, a story of, up or down.
Well, this sounds fun, trading narrative backdrops here. I have an answer. I have a couple of answers for this question, but let me just seize on one. The way I analyze the backdrop here is that we've had a number, I think, of trajectories that have led us to a place where numerous fault lines have opened up, I think, to set the stage for divisions between the American people that have, I think, sort of been covered by economic prosperity, but that have opened up and find themselves more easily opened up as that prosperity has receded and as certain other factors have bubbled up to the surface. And so I tend to think, I tend to look at this in three lanes. Lane number one is demographic shifts in the country. Lane number two is technological, and I think that ultimately brings us to social media, of course. And lane number three is, in a sense, a combination of one and two. And that is the fact that I think for Americans of my generation, so April and I are 33 years old, for Americans a little older than us, certainly younger than us, I think that we've grown up in a country that in many respects has been sort of, our historical memory doesn't go much farther back than the 1960s. I think that that's where a lot of our sort of social foundations, our principles and convictions come from. So just take 1 minute to try and spell all that out quickly. prior to the 1960s, it is my understanding that, well, demographically speaking, the United States of America was a largely white country with an African American minority. Immigration from Latin America went up substantially in the 1960s. And coming out of the civil rights movement, I think that you had a period of time where America became ethnically more diverse. People from varying ethnic groups had more and more political power over the following decades. The LGBT community became more prominent. But what that meant was that you had a clashing of cultural conversations in a way that you did not have previously. You go into the 1980s, you have the coming about of CNN, followed by Rush Limbaugh and talk radio, suddenly the multiplication of cable news channels. Whereas in the 50s and 60s, you had three major networks, and Walter Cronkite was trusted by everyone. Going into the 21st century, you had the explosion of news sources and then social media, which allowed us to customize our own informational shells. And within that, you have a generation that grows up hearing the romantic stories of justice and the pursuit of equality and the heroics of folks in the 60s and that generation, but who aren't really rooted in a cultural language that gives them much to talk to their grandparents about. And so in my mind, that sets the stage for a lot of divisions. That's not the whole story by any means, but you pull back the prosperity that makes life more comfortable for people, and suddenly we are rightfully hypersensitive, well, at least rightfully very sensitive to the reality of injustices that are then magnified through the social media landscape, on top of all of these other pre-existing things. So that's how I look at the past that led up to this. I'm going to be quiet now and listen.
Okay, but what's your narrative?
Well, I just want to tell a slightly, I think most of those things that both of you have said are true. I want to take a slightly different aspect of the human condition and tell that history though. And
okay.
It's the history of the spirit and how it has been satisfied in different eras. And so, because I think that one of the driving factors, in fact, possibly the driving factor in the last 300 years, is the transformation of society from a fundamentally religious place to a fundamentally secular place. And so I would argue that human beings are, that much of your work, John, speaks to the spiritual, that the spiritual hunger that people are born with, and that the originally, say 100 years ago, that was partially satisfied, partially not satisfied by religious institutions, but at least there was a coherent and relatively universal framework into which those energies were channeled. And then I think that what happened next is that because, and to state the obvious, those institutions held sacred core values that are actually worth striving for, right? Love, forgiveness, sanctity, all these things. And then what happened is that there was sort of an awakening of sorts that showed how little, that rebelled against how little those institutions actually lived up to those values. And that was appropriate, right? Because the values themselves are the precious thing, not the institutions. But unfortunately what happened is that, and this started with philosophy, right? Like postmodernism and all that, there was such a profound disaffection with human institutions and with leadership and with people, that then we have emerged with a society that has sort of an underlying philosophical foundation that doesn't really allow for redemption or hope very easily. And so then now what we have are, and social media makes all of this worse, right? But now what we have is essentially, and then actually one sort of coincident phenomenon which has made this worse is that the structures of religious institutions are also some of the primary structures of community that people have, and those have also gone away, right? And I think that one of the truths in human life is that a lot of your spiritual needs will be fulfilled by the people around, by serving and loving the people around you. And so then when those communities disappear, you have people who have the same deep spiritual needs and spiritual ambitions that they've always had, and they get channeled into politics. They get channeled into, and people seek or come to deeply identify with political tribes because it's a way of feeling some kind of vicarious community, it's not satisfying. But because you don't have the ability to really grasp, and anyway, so then I actually wonder what your take on this is, John, because
yes.
it's,
well, this is
fascinating.
totally fascinating.
Room for redemption.
Great are assignments, Professor.
Okay, well, so
exactly.
No, I will integrate the discussion going on in this seminar classroom. So there's a really brilliant sociologist named Christian Smith who talks about moral narratives. And the story that John told is sort of equivalent to what Smith calls the liberal progress narrative. Sort of, everything was, things were terrible in racism and oppression before. And so it's up from that, but of course, with a lot of contradictions and problems now. But John's story beginning in the 60s was, not, it was more complicated, but it was that sort of a story. And then he says that conservatives often tell a Paradise Lost story, how once there was a time when there was meaning and community, and now modernity has smashed that. And all of these debates emerged in Europe with industrialization and the Industrial Revolution. And this is really the spur to the founding of sociology, and a lot of the great European sociologists, Ferdinand Tönnies and Max Weber, and especially Emil Durkheim. And it's also, this is great for us to be doing on this call, because what we see is that there is no one reality. Once you put a story on it, we can all interpret some of the same facts. Now we'll bring in different facts, but multiple stories can be true at the same time. And this is one of the most important lessons, I think, for members of Better Angels, is just the importance of listening to other people's stories. Because if you encounter just their claims, you're going to be really good at shooting them down. But if you understand, now wait a second, let me try to understand the story that by which they understand our country or themselves, then actually, with more sympathy and recognition of my own limits, I can see, I can see how that makes sense, even if I disagree with pieces of it or with their conclusions. That it really helps. The stories give us empathy. We are storytelling creatures. So to build off of April's, I think we can actually integrate all three stories in this way. We are storytelling creatures, and if you have some stability, a story will emerge. And as I understand it, the mid-20th century was a period of very low immigration, because immigration was cut off in the 1920s because there were too many people like my grandparents who came over in the huddled masses from Poland and Russia. I'm Jewish, and so the Jewish story is that gigantic wave of immigration from the 1890s through the 1910s. And so the Jewish story that I got from my parents, I think we're all very influenced in our stories by like our parents, maybe not so much our grandparents, is that the American story, which was created by WASPs in the mid-20th century, was actually a very good story. It wasn't, and there was some anti-Semitism, but it was mostly you can't join their country clubs. Basically, my parents told me America is the promised land for the Jews. This is the first place we've really just been set free to make a life for ourselves. And I think the data shows America is it's not an anti-Semitic country. Despite the uptick in extremist actions, the attitudes of Americans are very positive towards Jews, and they're getting much more positive towards Muslims. So we are, I think, a religiously tolerant country on average. Anyway, back to our story here. So there was a coherent story about America, and it was drafted by WASP America. And now, you know what? And David Brooks, I'm almost certain this is true. David Brooks once had an essay. I can't find it. I need to ask him. Maybe you know. He had an essay when Obama had maybe his second Supreme Court appointment, sometime there. David noted that in the United States, for the first time in history, there is not a single WASP as president, vice president, leading either party in either chamber or on the Supreme Court. Everybody was Catholic, Jewish. There was a Mormon or two. The only Protestant was Obama. And so this is a remarkable, and David pointed out, and the WASPs were very gracious. Like nobody's like, oh my God, this is. So they set up an open system on which people could compete. And my wife's parents came here from Korea in the 60s, and they had this very much the same story. So narrative. There was a narrative that stitched us together. And of course, people can object, hey, that's not my story. That was the WASP story. But if you're going to pick stories from around the world, that was a pretty good one to pick that at least allowed other groups to succeed. Now, obviously, the African-American story is different in a lot of ways. ways. But there too, there was a lot of progress. Okay, so here's the insight that I want to share with you that'll bring us to social media. I've been really taken since 2015 with the story of the Tower of Babel. So in the Hebrew Bible, the early people, they build this gigantic tower to rival God, to reach the heavens, and God is offended by their hubris. And he says, here's the key line. He says, "Let us go down and confound their language so that they may not understand one another." And I began to feel in 2015, something is wrong with the universe. Somebody changed something. Somebody changed like the gravitational constant. Something changed around 2015, and weird stuff has been happening ever since. And I couldn't put my finger on it until I began studying social media, and I wrote an essay in The Atlantic, came out last November with Tobias Rose Stockwell, where we really went into it and learned, what did social media do? And here's the key thing that I think most listeners won't know. Social media changed fundamentally between 2009 and 2012. So the original, the Facebook, it was called, and MySpace and Friendster, all they were was you put up a page and you say, look at the bands that I like, look at all my friends, look how many friends I have. That's not toxic. That does nothing bad to democracy. And so they begin to grow, and Facebook grows more than anyone else. And in 2009, Facebook adds the like button and Twitter copies it. Twitter creates the retweet button and Facebook copies it. And now both companies have huge amounts of information about user engagement, so they can algorithmicize the feeds so that now everyone gets fed not just what their friends posted, but things optimized to make them click. And that is especially anger, things optimized to appeal to them, to trigger emotions, to get them to act. So everything changes between 2009 and 2012. And by 2012, the tech companies have created an outrage machine, a machine by which people can say something or take a photograph or doctor a quote or whatever it is and get angry about it, and then get hundreds or even hundreds of thousands of people angry within hours.
And so our language was confounded.
Yes. So now that we have this outrage platform, now it's not possible to create a narrative anymore, at least not one that everyone can share or even most people can share. So a key idea in The Righteous Mind is the moral matrix, like the movie The Matrix. It's a consensual hallucination. And so I grew up in a country in which there was a sort of overarching American moral matrix, and there were sub-matrices all over the place. But when something big happened, there was a general understanding of what happened. It might be contested, but there weren't so many fringe theories that became central. And after 9/11, there was a general consensus about what had happened, at least for a few weeks or months. There were fringe theories, but they were, like that Israel did. But they were really, really fringe. But there was a general consensus about what happened, and George W. Bush got up to 90% approval. That will never happen again, I don't think, because on the other side of this shredding, on the other side of the knocking down of the Tower of Babel, we will never again have a widely shared understanding of what has happened. As soon as something happens, people get active creating an alternate reading of it, fitting in with their preconceptions. And so we quickly split into subgroups that are basically living in different worlds. I don't know if American democracy can work if we can't share basic facts, if we are wide open to manipulation by the Russians, by the agents of other countries, and by political entrepreneurs in our own country. A lot of this comes from each other. So my point is, yes, as John said, it's the demographic changes, it's the technological changes, but I really want to zoom in on social media. What began with we had broadcasting, as John said, we had broadcasting in the mid-20th century, but we got narrowcasting with cable TV. That's one of the reasons the problems begin, especially in the 90s. But social media took it to a whole different level, and something fundamentally changed about the moral, social, and political universe. And that's why everything is so weird now, or at least that's my telling. That's one of the factors by which things are so weird.
If I can offer a thought here, one of the things that we are most frequently confronted with at Braver Angels is the question: how on earth do you bring people together when they can't even disagree on basic facts, right? And I've found that your research, which has informed so much of the culture of not just our organization but so many others, But I feel that your research is vital in being able to provide an answer to that question, because many people are under the impression that if only we could agree on what a fact was in a given the policy situation, that there would be the opportunity for comity and collaboration. I'm not sure that's true.
No, I'm sure that's not true.
We can agree that it is a fact, for instance, that President Bush or Obama, take your pick, raised the deficit X number of dollars in a certain number of years. But we can't agree on the significance or the interpretation of that fact. If the deficit goes up in a certain period of time, it may be a sign of fiscal irresponsibility and thus be a bad thing, or it may be a sign that the administration is investing in public goods, distributing opportunity more equally, and that would be a good thing. What the answer that I tend to give to people, and April, I'd love to hear you follow up on this, is that what is important for us to establish a greater degree of not just civility, but genuine bonds of relationship and connection, such as I think is necessary for us to have the type of democracy that we want, is a genuine empathy and understanding of the moral foundations that folks on the other side of an argument are starting from, not for the purposes of agreeing with their conclusions, but to see how their moral starting place can resonate with some part of your own, right? Because even if we have different things that we emphasize in a moral framework, I'm coming from a place of concern for concern for fairness in my looking at policy. You're coming at a place of concern for tradition or sanctity. We can still recognize these as being goods between each other. And so when I try and think of the current moment and how we deal with social media and the fracturing of the landscape, what I wonder is it not possible for us to engage the conversation, organizations like Brave Angels and people beyond, to say, let's create a narrative that doesn't rely on us having the same set of statistics that we agree on, but rather on our being able to come together and tell a story that does honor and dignity to the differing moral perspectives that we're starting with, and yet makes those the same story. And so there's obviously more to say on that, but April, I'd be curious to know how on or off I might be there.
I have a number of thoughts, but I can see John sort of itching to respond. So you can feel free to go first.
I'm reticent to keep April out of a conversation, John. So just know that's why I always look over. Sure I'm not.
Okay. I'll respond to what John just said, and then
Yes.
April, you add on. So John, you're contrasting sort of the rationalist approach, which is if only we could start from the same premises, we could reason our way to the same conclusion. And I think that is demonstrably false. A lot of the righteous mind is about how our rationality, our reasoning is actually generally in the service of our social needs. It's not, our reasoning isn't very good at finding the truth. It's very good at helping us navigate social world, stay in the good graces of our teammates, protect our reputations, deceive others, deceive ourselves. So I don't think you get very far by starting with facts and trying to get everybody to agree on the same facts. And so you focus on values instead, which is definitely a better place to start. But I would actually do that. The key is the relationships and the people, and then along with that, the values. And then you can get to the facts afterwards. And so, yes, you could certainly start by saying, well, let's learn about, liberals and conservatives and libertarians and what are their values. You can start that way. But I think generally speaking, so I'm a social psychologist, and I generally think that social relationships just dominate everything else. They dominate teaching, reasoning, facts. And so if you look at what Braver Angels does, everybody these days wants a platform that's scalable to millions. And, I think when David was launching, I think a lot of people were skeptical, like, really, you're going to get like groups of people meeting? Like, how many millions of people can you do that way? But that is the best possible way to get people to open their hearts. And if you open your heart, then you open your mind. If your heart is closed, your mind's not going to be very open either. And so we're very good because our species is both tribal, but if you look at traditional societies, they're not just like closed off groups. They're really interested in trade, exchange, political alliances, exploration. We're a curious species, and we're a cooperative species. So if you bring people together, over a meal, and they know that they have a shared future or they have things in common, then now they're in a mindset of I don't want to alienate this person. I actually, I want to get along with this person. I want this to go well. And then you're much more able to listen to to why they care about this thing that you think is so obviously stupid or irrelevant. So the values are very important, but I think they come out best, or we can appreciate them best, when we are interacting with people who actually hold them. And that's what I think Braver Angels does so well. I should just say, I know that the two of you are more optimistic about the future than I am, but I think that's because you're actually dealing with real Americans interacting face to face. And there, I think the story actually is pretty good and pretty hopeful. We're a nation of mostly reasonable people. Whereas I've been more involved, on like social media and dealing with elites that are battling it out. And there, I think the story is very dark. And Twitter is the worst possible place. If I could design, as a social psychologist, if I could design the worst possible place for people to interact in a democracy, it would be Twitter. Yeah. Anonymous accounts, everything is constrained to 240 characters. Okay, you can do threads, and it's all played out in front of an audience that is trying to show off how smart they are by attacking people. It's a horrible place for civility.
Yes. So I think that's just, actually, that might be the one fact everyone can agree on. That's just obviously self-evident and definitely true. And you're right. We are more optimistic, I think, John and I both, than you are. But I want to sort of enter the logic of cynical tribalism for a moment and ask a question from that vantage point, but it's an optimistic question, which is, I'm interested in, so I actually really agree with you. I studied anthropology, love Emile Durkheim, all of that. Their relationships are primary. And that's why, with regard to the history of the country in the last century, at least, I think the breakdown of community is as central as anything else. But in fact, more central than almost anything else, and also very difficult to remedy. But my question is, well, there's sort of two questions here. One of them is, it would seem to me that people will be tribal. My question is basically two proposals for you. The first is, can we create a moral tribe? I.e., can we create a tribe that's actually motivated by a good vision, and if necessary, where we define the common enemy as something like polarization? That doesn't usually work. I'm curious why it doesn't work. Maybe it's just insufficiently human. And then if that doesn't work, insufficiently, okay, well, there we go. Straightforward, cool.
It's like, hey, let's unite against inflation. Whip inflation now, Gerald Ford said, and nobody really showed up for the battle.
Nobody cared. Okay, fair enough. Yeah. So second option, it seems to me that one of the best definitions, that a good definition of radicalism, and one of the reasons I prefer little m moderates, is that radicalism means you're so devoted to one identity and one value, will sacrifice most of the others. Means you have competing ties to multiple values. And it seems to me that one of the benefits of the internet and so I love your word heterodox, right? Heterodox Academy. And America is, as you know, much more heterodox than all of our current narratives would suggest. Could it be possible for people to develop enough sort of sub-communities that they actually, although they don't like have a geographic community where they know a libertarian and they know a Republican and they know a Democrat, they nonetheless like have other communities that connect them to those people?
Yes, no, I think that's great. I agree with all of your premises and all of your conclusions. Oh, wait, there's one premise I don't agree with. So you said people will be tribal. Now, I actually disagree with that. What I mean is...
Really?
Well, wait. What I mean is we evolved for tribalism, but tribalism is a dynamic. What it means is when we perceive threat, boom, we come right back together quickly. It's automatic. You look at the way kids play. So when there is threat or when there's any hint of us versus them, boom, we come together. But in times of peace and prosperity, this is part of John's narrative, is rising prosperity. In times of peace and prosperity, the guard comes down. Now, not equally on everyone. Some people who have a disposition that inclines them towards the left, their guard will come down faster, and they're going to go out and explore and want to travel to foreign countries. But all of us, in times of when we're not threatened, we're much more open. We're not particularly tribal. So tribal is not that we're going to be tribal every day. It's we're going to be tribal when the conditions call for it. And boy, do conditions call for it now. At least, again, I think social media is a big part of the amplification of it. But I would say the goal is not necessarily to try to unite. Let's unite all Americans against, global warming or racism or a loss of community. Let's unite against a loss of. I mean, I see why you're pursuing that, but I would actually prefer a different way, which is let's try to lower the threat level, so that we're not at DEFCON 10. We're not at our highest setting for tribalism. We're actually more on the open side.
But does that seem does that seem feasible? I mean, it seems to me that, so again, I have a bit of cynic too. It will always be expedient for political leaders to invoke threat, right? If that's the fastest way to get people to do things.
Yeah, that's right. And that's an aspect of the way we have a two-party system, and we have, our election laws allow for almost unlimited, not just spending, but all kinds of commercials that it's very hard to regulate the messaging, of course. So I think that we should attend to the nature of our commitments, and a lot of people think that if you love your group, therefore you're going to hate other groups, but that's not true. Research in social psychology shows that if you ramp up in-group love, you don't generally hate the out-group, you just love the in-group more. So if you look at sports leagues, like intramural sports, a school that has no intramural sports versus a school that has intramural sports leagues, well, when you've got different teams competing with each other, you actually have more school spirit and more friendships, and people get very bonded to their team, but it's not because they hate the other team. So that's a form of very healthy tribalism. It's play tribalism. It's not, it's at a very mild level. But of course, sports can turn into, English soccer hooliganism, where, you go to bash people's heads in. And I think American politics, I don't want to pretend it used to be all lovely and loving. Of course, it never was. But, it is a lot nastier now than it used to be. So I would look to that strategy. Oh, and then to pick up on what you said, given that we can have lots of identities, lots of groups and tribes, you can imagine one country in which all the identities were nested, so that you might have an identity as a subset of a religion, but the people in that religion are all in one party, and that is a very unhealthy form of tribalism. Whereas a much healthier form is we've got lots of cross-cutting things. So, on Sunday we might be in different churches and synagogues and mosques, but on Monday we're in different companies, and on Monday night we're rooting for different sports teams. There was a really good book.
That's more true of America, right? Like that's actually more accurate.
Yeah, it probably is more accurate, but I think it's becoming less accurate. And so what I mean, so there was a great book called Us and Them by David Barabee, Science Journalism. I think this was like 15, 20 years ago. And he made that argument that he takes tribalism very seriously, and he says, if we can get people to have lots of identities that cross-cut, so lots of circles that are not nested, but rather overlapping, that's a healthy society. And I agree with that. As for evidence that it's changing, all I can point to is the Pew. This is not exactly direct, but you all know the Pew has done a great job of tracking changes in polarization. And one of their findings, in addition to the general rise of affective partisan polarization, the general rise of hatred for the other team, is uniformity of attitudes within each team. So on the 10 attitude items for which they have data going back to about 1994, it used to be that if you were a Democrat, you would have the predictable position on 6 out of the 10, or same thing for Republicans. I don't know if it was 6 exactly, but the point is, it was some number. It was not 8 or 9 out of 10. But over time, it's gone up to the point where now, again, I don't know the exact number, but now it's like 8 or 9 out of 10. So if I know that you're a Republican, I know your views on almost all the issues, whereas 30 years ago, that wasn't true. We are becoming more orthodox. If you are a member of a team, you have to accept their beliefs. And if you question those beliefs, you will be crucified on Twitter and ostracized. So that's one of those alarming trends that I see.
Professor
John, you had your hand up? Go ahead.
I had my hand up. Actually, I would like to offer a defense of the feasibility or plausibility of, I suppose, constituting a moral tribe in this way. I think that there is a real way in which, for all of the excesses that perhaps we have come to, and at least some of the culture that we have come to associate with it, I think that there is a way in which what has um, been known to us as multiculturalism um, has within its history and within its reality something of a realization of a tribe that has come together across what you might consider to be conventional tribal categories
Yes.
to establish a unity on the basis of deeper
Yeah.
principles or
Yeah.
first
E pluribus unum. It's a nation based on an ideal, not a bloodline.
well, that's right. That's right. And there's a long historic process that has gone into that being possible that I think sort of descends from our sort of starting point, the sacred values that you see enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and in our founding documents, and yet come to be more and more real over the course of successive generations as generations of freedom fighters, activists, protesters, intellectuals, religious, and other figures have fought to, one, create, of course, the pragmatic political context in which we could be more equal, but two, to establish the actual cultural, not just narratives, but within narratives, relationships, and also narratives that spring from relationships that have created the wider cultural context within which perhaps the three of us could be good and close friends or members of a tribe in some way. The power, I think, of, for instance, and this is the source of much of my professional and philosophical and social motivation, but I think that the power of the nonviolent philosophy and Dr. King's particular articulation of it in an American context was such that he took those higher ideals. He spoke a language of reverence for liberty, freedom, and justice in a fashion that honored Jefferson, that honored Lincoln, and honored the very same
Yes.
patriarchs of American history that many of his opponents also revered. Many segregationists and other Americans skeptical of King's program, while also, of course, looking and embodying so much of the ethical teachings of the gospel of Christ and holding these up as values that were sacred, that, again, so many of his social opponents also took to be sacred. That in weaving these sacred foundations into a story about the broader oneness of the American people, he managed to create a context, I believe, in which people from across the racial and, to a certain significant degree, political spectrum of American life, even in King's own time, were able to come together in common purpose and establish work and connections and relationships that have been now passed down generation after generation. I think in a lineage of unity to some degree that cuts across those conventional boundaries, but have allowed for the existence of, frankly, a person like myself who was born into a family context in a local community context that was very much multicultural, that had some different political and certainly different religious points of input, but within which, I was myself blessed to grow up in a community that felt largely unified on the idea that we are created equal, that we are entitled to equal opportunity, and even in a more sort of fine-tuned way, that it is simply good for us to be attentive to and empathetic with the differences in each other's sorts of ways of being, because we can learn from each other. That is just a norm in the world that I grew up in. We are different, but our differences can complement each other if we are willing to learn from each other. And that I see as a product of an American history that led to that. Now, I also see another side of that coin where suddenly, particularly when the relationship to the history that undergirds the sort of transformation of the classical liberal project into a multicultural but still faithful expression of American American virtue and moral foundation. There's a way in which a shallow relationship to that history produces a sort of multicultural tribalism that judges are living up to that on the basis of how many folks of different colors are represented in what proportion in a given room, which is fine. But then if a way of looking at society that doesn't, I think, seem to key in on that formula, but has other sorts of value priorities presents itself, it is judged very quickly to be possibly a racist or a possibly a sort of socially aggressive mindset, and the component of nonviolence and the accepting of differences across these different lines suddenly finds itself unable to extend to ideological differences. And I think that that's part of what creates the context
Yeah.
for a sort of radicalizing of multiculturalism, something that almost in its very name should exude a tolerance of different ways of being into something that could become, very much threatened and intolerant for reasons of fear and other reasons. And at that point, of course, we get into territory where you're far more fluent than myself, I think, in analyzing some of the components of it. But when I think of the idea of a moral tribe, and when I hear April say that, I hearken back to that history, that American history, of which I consider myself to be something of a product, as an example of the idea that, perhaps depending on how you define it, of course, but that it is possible for us to create a moral tribe that is not, of course, solely dependent on any of these other conventional factors. And in some respect, I see that perhaps as part of our project today as a continuation of that history. So I'd like to offer that to you.
Sure. I think it certainly was possible to do that, and I think we did it, and that was part of what was so exciting about the late 20th century.
Right.
So, King and the civil rights leaders were up against almost insurmountable odds, and they brilliantly used the moral resources available to them. Of course, they came out of the Black church, so they had the resonances and the virtues of Christianity. And then they wove that, as you said, he wove it in with the American religion, what's called the American civic religion. So, of course, the I Have a Dream speech is one of the greatest speeches, it's certainly in American history. Masterful in appealing broadly. But remember, this is back long before the Tower of Babel was destroyed. America was a Christian nation that had, and I just mean almost, what it was, 90-something%. This was America that really had a strong sense of American exceptionalism. America really had saved the world twice, and spectacularly in World War II, and then fighting the Cold War. So there was a widely shared sense, especially among the kinds of people that King was trying to appeal to, whites who were not his bitter enemies, but whites who were persuadable. He used a moral vocabulary. He could appeal to a common understanding of who we were in American exceptionalism. And what you outlined there is a view that I'm very, very supportive of, which is a kind of a liberal nationalism. That is, you can have a strong sense, or it would be good to encourage a strong sense of being American, that America is good. It is far from perfect. But what makes it good, or what makes it unique, is precisely that it was the first, or one of the first, or the greatest, or the biggest country that said, it's not about your race or your ancestors. It's about, you come here and do you accept the American idea, and do you pay homage to these founding documents? So that all was possible back before the tower was destroyed. But I don't know if that's possible again. On the left, there's a lot of anti-Americanism. I think it would be very difficult to appeal to create a sense of liberal nationalism on the left. The left tends to focus on America's sins, which are numerous, and of course on the right, which is generally much more patriotic. But now we are seeing emergent strands of right-wing thought. I mean, the rally in Charlottesville was called the Unite the Right rally. So I don't want to say that they in any way speak for most conservatives, but we have some very loud elements on both sides that are very difficult to bring to a kind of a liberal nationalism. Now, I should say, David Brooks, Larry Summers, there are all kinds of people who a few years ago were writing about this kind of inclusive nationalism, a vision of America that is morally good precisely because it is striving to be inclusive. So I still hold out hope for that. But I think even though King faced vastly greater odds of political and social reform than we do today, but he also had he had available to him more resources. There was less chaos. And as April has been saying over and over again, the decline, the destruction of community, the loss of that sense, we have a lot more anomie or normlessness now. It's a much more chaotic state.
I think that's true, but sorry, go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say, just to speak briefly as a person who is who is himself. I mean, you mentioned the anti-Americanism on the left, and this particularly sort of within the Trump voting base, not all, not most, but within the base, a particularly somewhat hostile faction there to the idea of this liberal sort of liberal patriotism or nationalism that you espoused. I look at that formulation from the vantage point of a person who is himself, an African American who's had deep life experience in inner city Black life, which the attendant politics are very much sympathetic to what you've articulated, and a person who has a white father from an older generation from the South who is a very committed supporter of President Trump's.
Mm.
And what I have found, and perhaps one of the reasons I am optimistic, because I'm always with myself wherever I go, and so my conversations.
Funny how that works.
Yeah, I know, right? Tend to unfold according to a certain pattern. But I had a conversation just a couple of days ago, within which there were some tears, and many of my conversations over the last few days have included tears with many people, some of them from myself, and maybe you guys too. But I had a conversation with a friend of mine who I was talking to about Braver Angels, who I was asking if she might get involved because on the one hand, well, she's an African American woman who's very successful, who's very committed to social justice, and has great credibility within a visible section of that part of the landscape. But who I also understands our mission at Braver Angels and is fluent in other political languages to a degree. And she expressed to me the fact that her heart was breaking for many reasons, but in particular over the fact that many of the violent protesters and demonstrators, and by violent she doesn't mean people who are necessarily beating up or killing other people.
Yeah, no, yes, looting,
throwing bricks.
Yeah.
She said that it was striking to her that so many people were so quick to view that as the major tragedy of the situation, a broken window or two, when these very people are people who have spent, young people who have spent most of their lives seeing people who look like them, summarily killed by the very, representatives of the very state and government in the form of law enforcement and so forth that are supposed to protect them, that this is an expression of pain and reaction to that. And that this goes to the heart of what's so deeply wrong with this country at this time. And so she feels that deeply. I mean, I would hesitate to call her anti-American, but in making these sorts of points so intently, she makes those points in a way that resonates with the very folks on the left that you're talking about. And yet in communicating with her, part of the point that I made to her, and even speaking as a Black man, especially speaking as a Black man, was that, look, we share this history as Black people. But if you look at our history, if you look at where we started from, slavery and bondage, and yet through the vast sort of arc of not just social progress, but moral progress, leading the United States of America to live up more and more to the actual substance of her founding values, what I said to her was that, we have helped in all of these ways, through physical labor and through moral courage, to build America. And why, therefore, would we as a Black people want to come to a place to where if for all of our understandable frustrations and pains and sufferings, where we would want to see something fall that we helped build? What we want to do is build this up so we can pass it down to our children so that they can live up to the promise that we have sought to inherit by virtue of the sacrifices made by our own parents and grandparents, because that is our story as Black Americans. And she agreed with me, 100%. And what I can tell you is that narrative, I don't think is one that has many natural megaphones in the media landscape.
Yeah.
But when articulated, many of those same folks, and I speak particularly about African Americans, but I think different versions of this are true across the social justice landscape, narratives like that can take hold of the hearts and the ears of people who otherwise are in the habit of thinking that America is irredeemable. When we remember our own personal connection to this place in that way, I think there's power and possibility to change points of view.
That is a story which is a very compelling story. That is a narrative that clearly some African Americans hold, and that some people on the left hold. First, tell me, how old was this woman? What generation?
I think she's probably, she's a little bit older than me. She might be 39 or so.
Oh, okay.
39.
Okay,
Maybe.
I was just wondering, yeah, because I think that may be more open to older people.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
Yeah, and also older. I mean, in the 20th century, the American system, the American government largely worked and the country was, in a sense, triumphant over other systems. Whereas the 21st century has been one of decline in prestige, and the rise of authoritarian and other systems. So I'm heartened to hear that some African Americans can tell such a story, despite the ongoing indignities and inequalities. I don't know what the prospects are for having that be widely shared, and I think there's certainly much less. Those prospects are much worse now than they were, say, a month ago.
Well,
yeah. So that's related to this question is simple. One of the reasons I still have a lot of hope in this, two actually. One of them you named, which is that I do a lot of work with people on the ground, and that's a lot more inspiring than the disembodied national conversation. But it seems to me that America has always been strongest at the local level. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's weaker than it has been because of the decline of community that we talked about. But I wonder, I once again have two proposals for you, and feel free to shoot them down, but they're my optimistic volleys. The first is, my hope is that even if the national sphere falls apart, and really to some significant degree, it already has, does that mean that that will necessarily take victory over local relationships? I don't think it will. And then also, it's if what this is coming from, in my view, again, my story is that these divisions are ultimately coming from moral hunger, from spiritual hunger, from a need to belong, from all those things. And so it seems to me possible, particularly given that technology evolves, and yes, Twitter is a cesspool, but virtual reality, I think, activates more aspects of the brain that are like, oh, that's a human. I should engage it like a human. So technology will evolve. And if what this is really coming from is moral hunger, if we can tell a powerful enough moral story, why wouldn't, it seems to me that should, there's reason to believe that could fill people up enough that they would be loyal there, rather than to tribes, than to political ideologies, which are ultimately unsatisfying.
I can see a future, 20, 30 years from now, in which there is such a story, but we won't get there just because somebody came up with it and said, hey, I got it. Here's the story. Let's go tell it. And so I've been getting very interested in cyclical theories of history. I haven't read Strauss and Howe, The Fourth Turning, but Peter Turchin is a Russian mathematician who has books, The Age of Discord. He predicted in 2010, actually, that based on his modeling, we were due for a major bottoming out, a major coming apart around 2020. And he put that in writing in 2010. And so I guess let me maybe try to integrate all of this by saying, in the long run, I am optimistic. I don't necessarily feel that in my heart right now, but from having read Steven Pinker on The Better Angels of Our Nature, also Matt Ridley, The Rational Optimist, Robert Wright's book, Non-Zero, all of those three books tell stories about how there is a direction to history. And as we find new ways to cooperate, wealth goes up, cooperation goes up, and we never have major reversals. So history, for the last few hundred years at least, really has had a direction. And while there are dips, there are dips in well-being, there was World War II, it's not a perfectly straight line. But things do go up over the long run, and you'd be foolish to bet against humanity and say that 100 years from now things would be worse, and you would be foolish to bet against America and say that 100 years from now things will be worse. So in the long run, I think we will work this out. But I think the expectation that a lot of us have that, things are bad because of this or that, and if we could just change the president and change social media, then, then things would be good. I don't think that's true. I think our problems are deeper than that. I think we are at the end of a cycle. Our understandings of who we are, our understandings of politics and the nature of our institutions are not working. And I think there could be a lot of disruption. There could be more violence. I don't want to predict that. I certainly hope there is not. And again, Steven Pinker really helps us here by saying, in the 1968, there were a lot of bombings. I mean, a lot of people were killed in 1968 domestically. And that is not happening now. Obviously, there is some violence, but it's nowhere near what it was. So I don't want to be too alarmist and say, we're on the verge of civil war. I don't think that's true. But I have no idea when things will turn around or how painful this bottoming out will be or what it will take to break our old understandings and make room for new ones of the sort that you, April, just mentioned. So, maybe we'll get to a happier place in a couple of years. Maybe it'll take 20 years. I have no idea. So I don't know if that's optimistic or pessimistic, but that's the way I'm feeling now.
Well, I don't blame you for feeling that way, but I do think that one way or another, we won't know how well we can do in response to this current moment unless we get out there on the front lines and tell the story that needs to be told and do the things that we have to do to make sure that that story is actually visible or hearable for Americans, beyond just the folks standing in front of us. And so it is actually, I think, a work that needs to be done. But if we believe that we have some power to do it, we ought to try, right? And
absolutely,
I agree with you, John. Don't bet against America.
Sorry. That's right. If I could just to close up my piece of this, I've been thinking about political polarization in the country, and as April, as you put it, like what the disembodied national conversation. And that is a mess, and that there is a cause for despair. But, Braver Angels is not working on that. I mean, it is. Obviously, you guys are writing that. You are contributing to it. But your main work is helping Americans meet each other, get along, address local issues. And in the absence of a well-functioning national political system, that is really the best place to invest your efforts. If you want to make a difference, if you love this country, if you want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, the best thing you can do is act locally. And so, I love Braver Angels. I'm on the board. I don't know if that was mentioned early on, but I've known David since 2007. And David Blankenhorn. Oh, right, that's right. There's lots of Davids here. I know David Blankenhorn since 2007. I'm on the board. And so I want to commend you for all your work. I want to thank all the people listening, all the members of Braver Angels who do the work of trying to repair the social fabric at the local level. That is, I think, the best place that people can put their efforts these days.
And I really can say this honestly, John, and I hope that you feel this when I say this. Your research, your work has given body and confidence to so much of what all of us do. Again, so many people listening, and to April and myself specifically, as individuals. And so even if you don't feel entirely optimistic at moment, some of our optimism comes from you. Nevertheless.
That's right.
You've given us.
Oh boy, we're in trouble now. No.
You've given us some of the tools that we're working with, and we think so.
Okay. Well, John, April, it's a real pleasure to talk with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here with both of you, April, John, and for everybody listening. If you want to get involved in Braver Angels, and we hope that you do, learn more. braverangels.org. Until next time, we are building a house united.